Ukraine and Western nations are investigating allegations that Russian forces may have used chemical weapons in Mariupol. The claim was made by the Azov Battalion, a Ukrainian military group with far-right members. It said a Russian drone had dropped a poisonous substance on troops and civilians, causing respiratory and other problems. Russia has denied the claim. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy has called on world leaders to respond.
One of the Russian occupiers' spokesmen said that they might use chemical weapons against the defenders of Mariupol. We treat this with the utmost seriousness. I would like to remind world leaders that the possible use of chemical weapons by the Russian military has already been discussed, and already at that time, it meant that it was necessary to react to the Russian aggression much harsher and faster.
Well, we're now joined by our correspondent, Rebecca Ritters, who is now in the western Ukrainian city of Lviv. Rebecca, great to see you. Now, we're hearing allegations of chemical attacks being carried out by Russia. What do we know about the situation in Mariupol now?
Pablo, it's really difficult to get real-time information of what's happening in that besieged city. As you can imagine, communication has been cut from the city for more than a month. The mayor of Mariupol says at least 10,000 people are believed to have been killed in that city. President Zelenskyy puts that number at much higher than that, saying tens of thousands, in the multiples of 10,000. And seeing the pictures and hearing the stories of people who do manage to get out of that city, unfortunately, it certainly seems that President Zelenskyy's predictions, their estimations, are probably more accurate. I have spoken to some people who get out of that city, who've managed to make it out of that city, and basically talking of the most horrendous tales. I mean, if you can imagine the worst images of any war, that's basically what's happening in Mariupol. Some 100,000 people still believed to be trapped in that city without access to food or clean drinking water. But excuse me, obviously we're in the main square here in Lviv and it's quite busy and bustling, so the truck behind you, I hope you can still hear me. But now, of course, we're hearing an escalation, a potential escalation with reports of a chemical attack. Now, they are, of course, unconfirmed, but if true, would definitely signify an escalation.
Rebecca, how are Ukrainians coping with these allegations of chemical weapons being used?
People are understandably outraged at news of this, and as you heard President Zelenskyy there calling for much stronger reaction from the West. He's been careful, of course, because these haven't been confirmed yet. The Russians have denied carrying out a chemical attack, but the spokesperson for the Russian separatists came out on Monday and said that chemical weapons would be used to, quote, smoke out the remaining battalion in that area, protecting that city. So it is definitely plausible that chemical weapons could be used, but Zelenskyy being very careful to wait for confirmation. The UK and the US working very hard to verify those claims.
Rebecca Ritters in the Ukrainian city of Lviv. Thank you for that. Well, we're joined now by Alexander Keller from the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. He studies the use of chemical and biological weapons. Hi, and welcome to DW. Now, Ukraine's Azov regiment says Russia used a, quote, poisonous substance in Mariupol. How would specialists verify whether a chemical weapons attack actually took place, though?
Well, ideally, an independent investigation by a team coming from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in The Hague would be able to visit the site of the supposed chemical weapon use and take samples there, environmental samples, but also biomedical samples, which would then have to be analyzed.
Alexander, if a chemical weapons attack is confirmed, what would a meaningful response from the international community look like?
Well, I think, first of all, the international community should stick to the tools that are available internationally to hold the perpetrators of such terrible acts to account. That is, on the one hand, in the disarmament area, again, the OPCW in The Hague which provides a venue for such accountability, or the UN Security Council.
Well, if, for example, there are more sanctions, that could or would likely not impress Vladimir Putin. A military intervention is not appealing to the United States. So what options are there really?
Well, the options are not that many. We have, as I indicated, on the one hand, disarmament instruments, arms control treaties, and then we have international criminal law to hold perpetrators of war crimes and such atrocities as chemical weapons use to account. But that is a very long slog to achieve accountability and justice for the victims of such terrible acts.
Now, are the international laws to prevent the use of chemical weapons worth the paper they're written on?
I would say yes, absolutely, because we know about all the atrocities that happened in Syria through the use of chemical weapons, only because we have these instruments and mechanisms in place, and because the OPCW has been able to go there or go to neighboring countries of Syria and conduct these investigations. The fact that when the reports are then transmitted to New York to the Security Council, and the Security Council is blocked because of Russian vetoes, which we can assume would also happen if the supposed attack in Mariupol would be investigated that way and reported then to New York to the Security Council. That does not diminish the value and the validity of these mechanisms and these tools that we have.
Alexander Keller from the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy, thank you.
You're very welcome.
The big question right now is how can the claims of the use of chemical weapons in Ukraine by Russia be verified? And I asked Ralf Trapp, a chemist, toxicologist and arms control specialist.
Well, the key issue is going to be access. The question is, can you actually get inspectors or investigators into Mariupol and inspect the situation there, take samples, talk to victims, make medical examinations and things like that. So at the moment, that may be very difficult to do. The technicalities are not the issue. The issue really is how do you get safe and quick access of competent people, investigators, to the site? And if not, how close can you get and can you actually then provide access to people who were involved there, who were victims of the attack? Or can you get access to samples that have been taken in the area so then they can be analyzed afterwards?
Could anyone take these samples, or do you have to be a trained toxicologist, chemical expert to do that?
Preferably the latter, and also preferably with procedures that will afterwards demonstrate the authenticity of the sample and the chain of custody. That is one of the challenges you have in a situation like you have it now in a war zone, where, of course, many of the procedures that look very nice on paper will be challenged in the field when you have to deal with a real situation.
Now, what do we know in terms of the kind of capacity that Russia has to carry out a chemical weapons attack in Ukraine?
Well, as you know, Russia is member of the Chemical Weapons Convention and of the OPCW. So in principle, Russia should not have any chemical weapons. It has declared a stockpile. That stockpile has been verified and destroyed. So when we're talking about chemical warfare here, we are either speculating about the possibility that certain parts of the stockpile had not been declared and were still hanging around somewhere in Russia. I think rather in small quantities that is a possibility. We've seen the use of toxic chemicals against the Skripals in Britain and against Navalny, but I do not really expect that we're talking about large stockpiles. There are other options here that includes the use of toxic industrial chemicals and improvised weapons, or in fact the attack with conventional weapons on facilities that contain chemicals in the target area.
Now, how can people in Ukraine protect themselves against a chemical weapons attack? What should they do if they think chemical weapons have been used?
That's a difficult one to answer. Protection of civilians is a real challenge, not just in the situation as we have it in Mariupol, but in principle. I mean, what you can do is you can try and protect your face against the intake of aerosols, of gases, but against chemical weapons, this is really not very useful. Also, we know from Syria that people tend, in a bombardment, to take shelter in low-lying structures and cellars and bunkers and things. And this is precisely the area where gases such as chlorine can move in and then, in fact, kill or force people out of these structures.
Now, the Pentagon says it has concerns that Russia may use riot control agents like tear gas mixed with chemical weapons in Ukraine. Why would they do that? And what sort of damage would that do?
Well, first of all, I should say that the use of riot control agents as a means of warfare is also prohibited under the Chemical Weapons Convention. Why would they do that? They would do it to force people out of shelters, out of protective structures, into the open, and then they become targets of other types of weapons, either other chemicals or also conventional attack.